most of us would be very familiar with cognitive forms of intelligence. So what people refer to IQ. In education systems that translates into very academic forms of progress like GPA. Then over the past, I would say 20 plus years, there has been a rise in a different form of intelligence, especially in the workplace, emotional intelligence. So IQ and EQ. In fact, what we need is something a little different in this new economy that requires people to think about collaboration and teamwork. We need more of relational intelligence.
Welcome back to Wise on Air, the show where we talk to the world's leading minds on the future of education. My name is Bassem Hijazi, producer of the show. We often measure success through test scores, GPAs, and college admissions. But what if we've been overlooking the most fundamental ingredient for learning and thriving? What if relationships, particularly early loving relationships, are actually the key to unlocking our human potential? Our guest today is Isabelle Hau, author of recently published Love to Learn and executive director of the Stanford Accelerator for Learning. After immigrating to the United States over 2 decades ago, Isabelle has dedicated her career to making quality education accessible to all children, regardless of background. Her path has taken her from finance and venture capital to impact investing, including roles as partner at Imaginable Futures and US education led at Omidyar Network. In her groundbreaking book, Isabelle introduces us to what she calls a relational crisis affecting children today, and presents compelling scientific evidence showing how relationships literally change the brain. At a time when technology increasingly mediates our interactions, her research challenges us to reconsider what truly matters in our learning. So in this episode, Wise CEO and host Stavros Yiannouka explores how Isabelle's concept of relational intelligence might transform our understanding of education, and together they'll discuss the neuroscience behind human connection and examine how AI and technology impact relationships in education and consider some of the practical ways to create those environments where relationships take center stage.
Isabelle, welcome to Wise on Air.
Thank you, Stavros, for having me.
Congratulations on the publication of Love to Learn.
Yeah, it's been a journey, but a really fun one, writing and reflecting on what the future of learning should be and could be.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's clearly something you have a passion for, and so I really want to begin by asking you what your motivations were for writing the book.
Yeah, so there were two ones. There was one that was an experience during COVID that I had, which was meeting an amazing neuroscientist and pediatrician who works at Columbia University, Dr. Dumitriou, who showed me some data that were really deeply concerning about where we were with our youngest children. She was studying a cohort of moms with their young children in New York City at the onset of the pandemic. So mind you, really the worst of the crisis. But she was showing me that only 20% of young children had a strong emotional connection with their little ones. So, and then she showed me another data that may actually made me even more concerned, which was pre-COVID. So you ignore the impact of the crisis. And she showed me that 40% of young children before COVID had a strong emotional connection, so 60% didn't. And that led me to really look a lot more in depth at all those numbers. And that was piling on my personal experience of working in the early childhood field and having this deep personal belief, which is anchored in my personal story of why the early years matter so much, because it's early childhood for me personally, Stavros, as we have discussed in the past, has really been a lifelong life trajectory change, really.
Yeah.
Meaningful experiences also at a personal level.
So this really, your work adds to a growing body of evidence that validates what James Heckman, amongst others, has documented so persuasively, that the early years matter a great deal in education, and that investments in the early years yield a much greater return.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, Stavros. I mean, we have now known that the estimates have it as about 90% of the brain forms in the first 5 years of life. So this is a really critical period, foundational period for learning, for thriving, for flourishing. And from an economic standpoint, investing early is a great investment, as opposed to investing in remedial education later on. So not to say that we can't have excellent programs later on, but from a societal investment and also individual investment, much better to build a foundation like a house. If you don't have strong foundation from the start, then your house may shake if there is some form of earthquake or incidents. So the early foundations really matter the most.
Yeah, no, and I think, no, absolutely. And I think what's unique about the book is really the focus on relationships as the core of development, neurological development in this case. Do you want to say a little bit about about that, and about, you really begin the book by focusing on the relational crisis, as you call it, and you alluded to it in the motivation, in describing your motivations for the book. So do you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on that, and set the scene for us?
Yeah, let me speak actually about how we have thought about intelligence for a long time. Most of us would be very familiar with cognitive forms of intelligence. So what people refer to IQ, and many of us have had IQ tests or have had our children with IQ tests. In education systems, that translates into very academic forms of progress, like GPA in the US system, for example. Then over the past, I would say 20 plus years, there has been a rise in a different form of intelligence, especially in the workplace, that is referred to as EQ, emotional intelligence. So many of you may have also heard about this concept. So IQ and EQ. But I'm making the strong case that, in fact, what we need is something a little different from IQ and EQ in this new economy that requires people to think about collaboration and teamwork and all these things that are critical in the future of work, or this work that is emerging as of today. I'm not sure it's future. I think it's today's workplaces. We need more of relational intelligence. So what I call RQ. Which I believe is an essential skill that we have long ignored. And Stavros, you're correct that I write a lot about what I perceive to be a huge issue that we need to really focus a lot more on, which is this relational crisis around our children, but especially our youngest, because again, as we discuss, the earliest years matter the most.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about about the crisis, and what. Yeah, first, I think we would benefit, and listeners would benefit from maybe a deeper dive into what this relational crisis is actually about, and what some of the underlying causes might be, Isabelle. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are three. So there is not one driver, by the way, Stavros. So this relational crisis, there are multiple of them. And let me summarize them into three little buckets. One is simply the social networks around young children have been shrinking.
Yeah.
So if we think about, families are getting smaller because of fertility rates. So, for example, the number of single child household has doubled over the past 30 years, just as one example.
Yeah.
Grandparents are living further and further away. I was looking at a stat from AARP, which is this organization that's focused on older adults in the US, and they are showing that 50% of grandparents now live more than 200 miles away from one of their
Hmm.
grandchildren. Uh, so
Yeah.
anyway, the social networks have been shrinking around young children. But two, we have, of course, and this is a lot of people have been documenting the decrease in play activities in young children, and that has been largely substituted with more and more scheduled activities, and I would argue overscheduled activities.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
see it in my own family and in my own household. I feel like I'm the chauffeur of my young children, driving them from one activity to another, which means concretely that children have less time for free play.
Yeah.
And free play, based on meaningful research, has been shown to actually increase friendships. So little friends around young children and this ability to build authentic friendships is also decreasing. And then
Yeah.
the factor, which probably is on top of mind for many, many, many of us, is technology.
Yeah.
Technology is one of those tools that can be a force for good. It can also interfere with relationships. So we have to be watchful as educators, as parents, as family members about the impact when there is interference. What
Hmm.
some colleagues are calling technoference. Uh, the latest data show that any one of us and this is a US number, but I'm sure it applies globally,
Yeah.
uh, checks our devices 205 times a day. And
I can believe that.
yeah, I
It,
can relate.
yeah. Yeah.
I can relate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what it means concretely is that if we are with a young child, there are lots of opportunities for interruption of a beautiful play, activity or dialogue or dinner
Mm.
or any other form of family or relational activity between a child and a family member or
Yeah.
parent, yeah, or an educator for the matter.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of interesting observations that come out of what you've just described. I mean, the first that springs to mind is that the bowling alone phenomenon that Bob Putnam so eloquently described in his book. You're arguing essentially that this is now starting to set in very, very early
Exactly.
in a child's life, and some of the factors are structural, smaller families, but some are counterintuitively perhaps a result of attempts to fill that gap in smaller, a smaller immediate social circle with structured activities. But the argument that I hear from you is actually structured activities don't have the same impact as unstructured, because I'm guessing because kids don't learn how to build relationships for themselves, how
Exactly.
to build and sustain those relationships from themselves. They depend on whatever the structure is, whether it's a sports activity or a class, or there's always an adult in the room mediating that relationship, that set of interactions.
Yeah. And just to be clear, so there are actually two excellent research on this. One that's a little older from 2014 and one very recent on scheduled activities. Scheduled activities overall are great. They are very, very good for acquiring different skills, whether in sports, arts, music, and so forth, and just lots of benefits. I think here what we are discussing is really the overscheduling of kids. And so the latest research shows that and looked at what does 1 more hour of activities do, is it beneficial or not, and showed like an extra level of stress and anxiety for children who may be in that position because they don't have as much time to maybe do their homework if they are at the homework stage, or just relax, or just do nothing. And also the 2014 study showed that there was also a potential negative impact on creativity and resilience, as you note, Stavros. So the fact to be in those activities that are very structured is different from just letting a child free play, where free play for adults, for example, our creativity is some really funny research on this, happens most when we are under a shower.
Okay.
We go on a walk. Those moments where we are completely uninterrupted from anything when we are, free. So these free times are very, very important.
So
Sure.
opportunities to let the mind and the body wander, basically.
Exactly.
Wander both with an A and an O. Right?
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah.
I love that. With an A and an O. Yeah.
Please, you feel free to use it. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the consequences that you've noted, Isabelle, of this crisis, and tell us a little bit about some of the science behind the claims that you're making.
Yeah. So the science of relationships is very strong. Okay, there's an entire body behind the science of relationships. And there are two very important takeaways. One is on the very positive side, that if a child has, stronger, more nurturing relationships, the child will do better, both academically, socially, and even things that show that people live longer if they have stronger relationships. So longevity and health is being positively impacted. But the opposite is true, and that's also worth looking into. So I've been obsessing about this research on a very sad portion of our collective history called the Romanian orphanages. Period of, in the 70s and 80s under the communist regime in Romania, where the dictator then had this grandiose vision of saying, let's invest in population growth because it will drive economic growth. So he invested in a lot of pro-natalist measures, and the population started to grow. So it was successful from that regard, but economic outcomes didn't pan out. So you had a lot of, larger families that could not feed their young children, sadly. So they had to abandon a lot of the little ones in those orphanages. From a research perspective, this became, when this communist regime fell apart, a trove of data, because of course, for obvious reasons, we can't do research on adversity for young children.
No,
And it was one of the, one of those really incredible settings for researchers. So a number of researchers have been tracking many type of data, but in particular, one that I think is absolutely striking is brain. So they have been looking at, through MRIs and other techniques, the impact of the lack of nurturing relationships on young children. And what they have found is a profound difference in not only brain size, but also brain activity in children who had been staying in those Romanian orphanages relative to those who were adopted. And that brain size difference is 10%, so it's not like a small, difference, pretty meaningful size difference. And same with brain activity and all these, and many other academic outcomes and social and emotional outcomes that those researchers have been trying to suggest really strongly that a child who has been deprived from loving, nurturing relationships is meaningfully worse off. So both the positive and the negative side suggest very strongly that relationships drive a lot of the learning and thriving outcomes in a child.
Yeah. And am I right in thinking that it goes so far as saying that even lack of physical contact, right? So a lot of these kids didn't have anyone to hug them, to to just show affection in a tactile physical way, and that translates again into a lack of cognitive growth and development.
Absolutely, Stavros. There's actually another research in Colombia that looked at premature children who are born prematurely. And one brilliant doctor invented something that's fairly natural in many species. He called it the kangaroo children, which essentially asked a mother or dad to put their child close to their chest for little who were born prematurely. And the effect of human contact is incredible. So what the research has shown now longitudinally on those children who had experienced closer chest contact, like better outcomes from a life longevity, from a success outcome, and all these things. You're like, wow, just the fact of merely having touched the very earliest years of earliest moments of life makes a huge difference.
Yeah. I mean, there's just an overwhelming body of evidence and of literature pointing to this. So what is, I mean, you've pointed to some of the the challenges that have come about. Let's talk, maybe let's zoom in a little bit on on the impact of technology and how it appears to be exacerbating the problem.
So it's exacerbating in some cases, but also it can also be, again, a force for good. There are lots of technologies that can actually augment our human connections. That's one of the areas, Stavros, as we have discussed many times, the two of us, an area that I am personally really excited, where, but one where we need to, all of us, be a lot more intentional.
Yeah.
Where can relationships being centered in, tech development? And there are many examples, like, for example, at Stanford, we have developed a long time ago this tool called Find, that's a video coaching tool for observing a child and parent or child adult caregiver interaction.
Yeah.
time, analyzing those video footage was super expensive and lengthy, so we couldn't provide real-time feedback to the adult. Now with artificial intelligence and machine learning, we can analyze those video footage a lot faster and much more efficiently at a lower cost too. And we are able to provide that feedback in much more real-time manner to the adults, which also leads to better outcomes. So that's one example of many where technology can have a profound and beneficial impact on, human connections. But there are many examples.
And even with with the advent of AI, I recall around about this time last year when we were at your event at Stanford. I remember being very intrigued by the research showing the positive effect of fairly advanced chatbots on helping talk people down from potentially harmful thoughts. And so I'm not here advocating that technology is always and digital technologies and AI in particular are a negative factor in all cases. But I think in terms of increasing isolation and atomization and distraction and all the things that we talked about, I don't think we have thought carefully enough about the potential downsides and how it's really amplifying this bowling alone phenomenon or the relational crisis as you so eloquently describe in the book.
Yes, Stavros, I would love to see a lot more intentionality around it. So in the book, I have a dichotomy between what I call junk tech, a little bit like junk food, and relational tech. So the tech that connects us better and augments our human connections. I would love societally and for all of us to be a lot more focused on relational tech. The problem that I see right now is that we have very few tools that allow us to be mindful and distinguish between the two.
Yeah.
So, when we watch YouTube, for example, is it, a YouTube short that, maybe more in the junk tech category, or is it a YouTube that so many grandparents, for example, are there's this like trend right now on YouTube of grandparents connecting with their little ones, which I find really beautiful in terms of enhancing human connections. The problem is that we don't really know when it's one or the other. I would love to see more and more, so not only a greater focus on relationships from tech developers, or big tech developers and these large language models, but also more tools that allow us as consumer of those technology, whether we are parents, children, educators, and more grandparents, that help us distinguish when one is the other, so that we can be more informed consumer of those technologies. Simply like food. Now we have, information and labels on food that at least help us know whether there is, any form of trans fat or sugar content in the food intake. And we can do whatever we want with it, but at least we are more informed. Here right now, it's very, very difficult. The level of information is very poor.
Yeah. And also, I mean, the full extent of the impact isn't really fully understood yet, right?
Correct. I think there is an area of research in particular on this emerging AI trend where especially as AI moves more and more into anthropomorphic forms, whether it's an avatar or a social robot or a plush toy that has some anthropomorphic features. our ability to recognize what is human or not is going to be increasingly blurry.
Yeah.
So how do we increase this intentionality and this ability to support all of us to distinguish what is good or not for us is going to be
Yeah.
and for our children really increasingly important.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the other interesting thing that struck me about the book is that you sort of very unabashedly brought in the concept of love
Yeah.
and as being, of central importance. Let's say a little bit about it because I found it sort of somewhat counterintuitive because I guess being of Mediterranean and sort of Middle Eastern extraction, I would interpret, parental love as, being somewhat overbearing in some cases. You're involved in your kid's life to the nth degree, even when they're adults, right? And that's something, it runs counter to some of the things that you were saying about, free play, independent play, building resilience. So talk to me a little bit about what you mean in the book by love, and the essential role that it plays in education and in particular in early years development.
Yeah. Um, so here I was mostly referring to education systems where it is very rare, Stavros, to have even the concept of love associated with education. I think it's almost actually a taboo in most education systems, when in fact, I go as far as saying that I believe it is the silver bullet in education, and I've done a lot of work in system change before over my career, where often we say, "Oh, there is no silver bullet in education." Actually, I think this may be it, but it is taboo. So the words that we use in education are much more or at least the ones I hear, are achievement, excellence. They are not about, very, very, very rarely about, these concepts of love or relationships. When in fact, as we just discussed, they are some of the most important drivers. So I would love to see a lot more of those concepts being elevated in education settings. And what it means concretely is allowing teachers, which I believe actually this is why they join and why they stay in a profession. They want to be relational. They love
Yeah.
that relational element. Um, um, so how can we empower teachers and help them and support them wherever possible to be those relational agents for children? Um, in addition, this is not at the expense or minimizing the importance of rigor and achievement and all these
Yeah.
other aspects, but it's more balancing what we have known all along, that intelligence is cognitive, social, so cognitive, emotional, and social and relational.
And
And
relational. Yeah.
we have so focused on the cognitive aspect that we have forgotten the other aspects of intelligence.
Yeah. But I think it's important maybe to give some examples, Isabelle. I mean, what do we mean? How would love manifest itself in an educational context, for example? Or how
Yeah,
would a teacher play that relational role that you want to
yeah,
see?
yeah. So by the way, I think that a lot of teachers already play that role, is more helping them do maybe even more of that, okay?
Yeah.
And it could be in the form of having more time and capacity and trainings to be effective in this regard, or more effective in this regard. And maybe, for example, this is an area where AI could help on reducing some of the administrative tasks and burdens that teachers have, so that they may have more time for relationships. Um,
Yeah.
or maybe also being looking at relationship goals, whether it's for teachers or for little ones, and be more intentional about does a teacher know about all the interests and of a child, or the family aspects of a child, ensuring that a school is looking at including family members and other people around children, as what I call relational hubs. Anyway, like all these things that can be, and some can be very, very easy to implement at very little cost, and then some are maybe harder to implement, as always, and maybe, but a lot of things can be very simple.
So I think what you're advocating for is really for the teacher to take an interest in the relational health of his or her students, to look and to I guess within the education system, to facilitate and enable the development of those relationships, right? That's where if I'm understanding, the argument correctly, that's what you see as the role that teachers can play.
That's one of the elements, but I'm also saying that relationships, just to be clear, Stavros, relationships happen in many contexts. So if we want to have more of this relational intelligence grow everywhere, we need to think about how it manifests in families and ensuring that family time becomes a lot more relational time. Look at schools and the role of a teacher to be increasingly relational. We need to think about play and ensuring that there is playtime for children to be relational with other little friends, and then thinking also about communities, and how can they also advocate and invest in relationships. I love, for example, of the movement on play everywhere, places everywhere, play everywhere, where a child and an adult can play at a bus stop, for example. Anyway, like all these elements are part of the concept of relation is complicated because it's actually a network concept, not a one person only.
So we're now going into, I guess, into the realm of, of solutions. And I think you've articulated, a number of, of possibilities, and also, I guess, shone a spotlight on the interdependence between them. I know this is this is not the entire answer, but what would be your top 2 or 3 ideas that you would want to see implemented, whether it's at the level of the school or even within families? What could parents do? What could teachers do to bring this about?
Yeah. So so at the family level, I would love family time to become more relational time. In very concrete terms, what parents can do is ensuring that they dedicate time for play or for very special relationships. It could be as simple as ensuring that dinner time is free of any screens, or protecting that very, very special window before bedtime, and ensuring that there is a reading or playing session uninterrupted from any digital interactions with a little one. Those things sound really obvious, but in our societies, we just need to be reminded of the importance of prioritizing those very special moments. In early learning, in early childhood context, again, like one of the recommendations that has literally very, very little cost is ensuring there is playtime.
Yeah.
So this is a global phenomenon, but certainly a US one because of our focus on achievement. We have had a meaningful reduction in recess time
Yeah.
and the activities for young children. So we need to, that's a very easy thing to implement, is just ensuring, and a lot of states actually are moving in that direction. New Hampshire, for example, other states are now implementing laws to
Yeah.
protect recess, which is interesting.
Recess. Yeah.
Yes. But ensuring that it sounds so obvious and really very, very little cost. But it needs to be repeated and recentered in our
Yeah.
lower settings. And then, at a more community level, what I would love to see more models emerge between a family and traditional school systems or early school systems. For example, very inspired with models like Training Grounds in New Orleans or Tutu and Me in Hawaii that offer a number of classes that are a lot more flexible for children that are raised by a grandparent or an auntie or
Yeah.
so where those adults also are looking for those opportunities to connect maybe with other adults, but also are looking for some form of scaffolded instruction that may
Hmm.
not be a full-time one. So very inspired also about those models that I think a lot of families would like to see more.
Yeah. Would something as simple as, facilitating more play groups and maybe providing public spaces
Yeah.
where those play groups can gather, would something like that be at the sort of community level helpful?
Very helpful, and this is exactly what Tutu and Me and Training Grounds essentially do. So Tutu and Me, for example, so Tutu in native Hawaiian means grandparent. And what they do is that they leverage community centers in multiple places in the state of Hawaii, um, where essentially a grandparent or some other person raising a young child can go. And it's generally offered 2 to 3 times a week, but it is play-based, so it's very much of a play group, as you call it, Stavros. And then what I like a lot about their model is that it is somewhat scaffolded, so there is a lot of nice thinking about what kind of play could be leading to the best learning outcomes for the young children. So the model has had nice evaluations that show some really strong outcomes for the young children. But also, I suspect, I don't think they looked at the benefits for the family members and the adults, but I suspect there was also a lot of benefits for the adults involved.
Yeah, no doubt, right? Because I don't. Of course, we do emphasize the importance of relationships in terms of development. But as you pointed out, and the Blue Zones work, I think bears this out, that they continue to be important throughout life, and people who can maintain relationships do live longer, better, healthier lives. So absolutely critically important. Isabel, what's, again, what's if you were to make a call to action for communities, what would it be? I mean, what are you hoping listeners will take away from our conversation, and what steps can they take to make a difference? in their lives and in the lives of their community.
Yeah, so my key call to action is to recenter on something that we all know is important. We all know that relationships matter. I'm not bringing anything here new to any of the listeners. Anyone knows this is what is really critical, but we take it for granted. So my call to action is not to take it for granted and say it is actually, if anything, the crisis of our times. It's not anything else, it's relationships. So how can we recenter everything we do as parents, as community members, as educators onto relationships? And obviously, different people would have different roles, but if you're a parent focusing on this relational time, if you're an educator, think about how you can become the relational brain builder that you already are, but emphasizing this. And if you're a community member, how can you advocate for more of those activities in your community to be relationship-centered? And for all of us, to really look into why don't we measure and track relationships if we know this is the most important in learning, in longevity, in thriving, in lifelong success. Why don't we focus more on this critical topic of relational intelligence?
No, absolutely. So let's tell listeners how they can get a hold of the book and how they can find out more about you, Isabelle, about your work, and if there are any resources that are available to people who are interested in putting relationships back at the center of their parenting, of their education.
Yeah, so in terms of ways to find the book, the easiest is probably for my publisher's website, Public Affairs and Hachette. But the book is also available on all major platforms, whether Amazon or Walmart or all these, and all smaller bookstores as well.
Yep.
Also, my website, isabellehau.com, has a lot of those links available there. So that's an easy platform to find more information. I will also be adding, Stavros, a compendium to the book very soon that will have very actionable recommendations for each one of parents and teachers. So that will be soon available for all the listeners as well.
That's great. So the book is Love to Learn. The author is Isabelle Hau. It's been an absolute pleasure, Isabelle, having you on Wise on Air and talking about this very important work. We'll be sure to provide the links in the show notes when this pod is released. So thanks very much for the conversation.
Well, Stavros, thank you. I learned a lot from this conversation and a pleasure to be with you as always.
Yeah, and I think we've only just scratched the surface. So really, I do encourage people to get a hold of the book and delve deeper into the topic.